Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for our Community Guide to Solving the Digital Divide webinar, presented by our community supporters, ADVA, Juniper, and Cisco, and our Michigan Moonshot Educational Series sponsors, Kitch Law Firm, and Informatica. High-quality home internet access is essential. In recent months, the digital divide has become even more apparent. Although short-term solutions like Wi-Fi buses and hotspots are being deployed, long-term solutions are necessary to ensure that everyone is connected. I'm Megan Martin, Marketing Coordinator for Merit Network. Joining me today will be Chris Mitchell. Chris is the Director of Community Broadband Networks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Chris researches and publicizes the benefits of publicly owned broadband systems for the ILSR. He edits muninetworks.org, which covers network and broadband policy on a daily basis. This webinar will last 60 minutes and will include a question and answer session at the end. You may submit a question at any time by clicking the chat icon in the row of options at the bottom of your screen. This session is being recorded, and a link will be sent to our attendees within the next few days. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it to Chris to get things started.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be on another Merit webinar. As I'll note at the end, I think that Merit is doing tremendous work that is benefiting the entire country with the resources it's putting together and its creativity and dedication to improving internet access. So I'm excited to be here and talk about some of the things we're seeing in terms of short and long-term planning to improve internet access. I like to start by making sure we're all on the same page. And I've said this before, and I actually did an entire webinar about broadband basics, I believe. So I'm not going to delay over it, but ultimately, internet access should be something that is available to everyone, kind of like other utilities. You shouldn't have to know what a megabit is to be able to buy a device in a store, bring it home, and know that it will work well in your house. The network should be able to support any manner of devices, many of which will be operating at the same time. I often say that I don't have to turn off my lights to use my toaster, and that's the way the internet should work too. One of the things to keep in mind if we talk about speeds of the internet is that a common refrain is, oh, well, what application actually needs a gigabit or 100 megabits or something like that? And that's actually not the right question. The right question is really, what does a household need? And households have many devices. In fact, if I was to ask you how many devices you have that are using the internet in your home, and you gave that number and then you went home and searched around, I bet you'd find that there was more, maybe twice as many as you were thinking of that are using the internet, some of them concurrently, and networks should be able to support all of those devices at the same time. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance is a 45, 47-year-old organization, something like that now. And we focus on a variety of issues about keeping the economy strong locally. I've been running the internet silo, our broadband community networks program, for about almost 15 years now. And we really focus on what local governments do to improve internet access. We spend a lot of our time studying municipal broadband options, but we've also looked deeply into cooperatives. And we certainly encourage public-private partnerships, other arrangements. We do a lot of work looking at local ISPs that might be private. We think that there's an important ecosystem to solving these problems. And we don't think any one solution is appropriate for everyone at the same time. Some of the things that we do is we produce podcasts every week. I do a podcast with someone on a subject about local broadband or broadband policy more generally. We have more than, I think we're publishing 450 next week. So it's been quite a few, and there's actually a number of bonus episodes there. We've covered all manner of topics over the years. We produce videos, reports, data, daily stories about what's happening in this space. Generally, a lot of information, just a lot of background. If you're trying to figure out what happened years ago in a state, you can scroll back in our archives to see it. And then there's a little reminder about the Broadband Bits podcast, which little hot tip. We're going to be talking about Michigan in an upcoming episode that we're recording later today. So stay tuned for that. One of the things we've done is compiled all of the municipal and cooperative networks around the nation, and we put them on this map. You can see the bright orange is the most overwhelming because telephone cooperatives have quietly done a very good job of connecting the United States. And in the lighter colors, and the lighter purple is more of a standout, we see where electric cooperatives have made bold commitments to cover areas that they serve. This map is now dated. It is actually quite a bit larger in terms of what the electric cooperatives cover. The state of Mississippi, for instance, now has 25 electric cooperatives that are building fiber. The state used CARES Act funding to bolster that with $75 million to build fiber across rural Mississippi. Arkansas is seeing a ton of investment, even beyond what we show here. Some of the states that are some of the worst in access right now will soon be some of the best states for internet access because of community approaches to broadband. But then you also see the municipalities, which look much smaller than the cooperatives, but they actually cover a similar amount of people, as best we can tell in our estimates, because they tend to be more dense areas. So this is where we see community networks having already made an impact as of 18 months ago or so, and it's only grown since then. So as we talk about this, and you know, many of you who are concerned about broadband prior to the pandemic hitting, I think we're deeply concerned about the role of the homework gap. The number of kids, I think, usually placed around 12 million children in the United States who go home to not having an internet access connection. And when libraries were open, and frankly, you could go and spend time in a McDonald's safely, um, you know, it wasn't as big of a concern for some people. There's certainly elected officials who felt that it would be nice to have home connections to everyone, but the libraries and McDonald's would take care of things as needed. That is no longer possible. I think it is very clear that we need high quality home internet access in every home now. So when it happened, there's this question of, okay, all of a sudden we have millions of children who are unable to go to school and they do not have a connection at home. It is not safe for them to do much. You know, you can't build a fiber to the home network by next weekend. It's not going to happen. And so your choices are somewhat constrained. And so school districts often work with local ISPs. I think Comcast Internet Essentials is the most well known, and that's because it's probably the best. Comcast may have connected more families over the past 10 years that are in a low income situation to a $10 a month option than all of the other big companies combined. There's just no understating the role that Comcast has played in terms of what it's done in comparison to the other big companies. So one major option was to work with companies like Comcast to use their existing networks to turn them on at a reasonable price. And school districts engaged in bulk buying of these in several major cities. And we're trying to track it elsewhere, but it's frankly difficult to come that data quickly. In other cases, school districts or local governments would use 4G or 5G modems, depending on the situation, where you would use a cellular modem that would use the same kind of signal from T-Mobile or AT&T, and that would be translated into a Wi-Fi signal within the house, and family would be able to use that. In some cases, those were more expensive than others. There's a lot of challenges with a very large company like a T-Mobile or an AT&T to make sure everyone was on the same page. So we saw some difficulties regarding bandwidth caps and things like that in the early days, but these devices have been essential to very rapidly being able to make sure that students in their homes would be able to access the internet, to be able to access the school networks, to participate in classes and do their homework. And so the nice thing about these sorts of solutions is that they're very fast to deploy. The cable companies, the existing wireless mobile networks are quite robust, and these companies did a wonderful job of adding capacity as needed to make sure they could handle a sudden influx of thousands or tens of thousands of people, depending on the region that were using them. Um, so it's fast and it's scalable, but some of the cons are that it is quite costly over time. And the second you stop appropriating, everyone who has these will lose access. For all of its good work on this, Comcast is not going to make Internet Essentials free next year for millions of people. I would not expect. And so when you engage in these kinds of solutions, you're not building anything that can stand the test of time. You have to keep appropriating money year after year to make sure they continue. I think that a fiscally responsible solution from government is one that would not require potentially increasing appropriations year after year. The most elegant design would be one in which you pay perhaps a higher upfront costs, but then it will continue to work long after the appropriations have gone out. And I think of the kinds of networks that we're going to talk about soon as life raft networks. That's not as common an expression as gap networks, which I will use because it is more common. Um, but I think conceptually it is worth thinking about these things as a life raft. These are networks that are not designed to permanently solve the problem. They are designed to get us through a difficult period while we are making the investments necessary to permanently solve this problem. And so as we saw some of these gap networks and different strategies, I wanted to start with some of the things that we saw in terms of companies that stepped up and put Wi-Fi in their parking lots, or engaged in other strategies so that there was more places to choose from for families that had to leave their homes to get internet access, so they could access it safely from their cars or something like that. There's places that put wireless modems on school buses and would park them deep into neighborhoods so that people could access them. Many of these strategies had been developed before the pandemic, and so they were kind of expedited and improved over the tension of the pandemic. One of the ones that I particularly love is Ozarks Go, a cooperative in northern Arkansas. They started by putting some wireless devices in school buses that they parked in the area, but they found that the wireless network was insufficient to meet the demand of the people who tried to use it, and so they trenched fiber to a school bus. So they had fiber to the school bus. And the school bus at that point is basically providing shelter and power and security for the devices, so that others can come nearby and use it. But um, you know, one of the benefits of the school bus is that it's mobile, but it isn't so mobile when the fiber is attached to it. Then we also saw communities that were building more extensive fixed networks. And in the Canal neighborhood of San Rafael, which is in Marin County in California, this is a neighborhood where a whole lot of the people that do the service jobs for the Bay Area live. It is one of the counties with the greatest amount of inequity between the incomes of people who live in this neighborhood and the people that are extremely wealthy in Marin County. And so they built a Wi-Fi network that was available on the in the public on major. They would put devices on major buildings, and it came together largely with philanthropy, volunteer effort, and real intelligent coordination from local government folks, but also some important private sector actors who, some engineers that worked for the companies that were involved in this or had the kind of technical background that would be helpful. And so this network was designed that some people who lived in the right areas, maybe right off the street, might be able to get their access in their homes, but they would at least be able to go to a place where they would be able to get outdoor access. This is one of the major considerations as we're thinking about short versus long term. To succeed in delivering internet access over the short term often means making compromises, such as only having it available outdoors, which is not ideal. As I mentioned at the beginning, we really need to get it indoors. Getting it indoors is quite challenging because of the technologies that tend to be available. There's few that allow you to get a signal that's of high quality inside a home without having to send a person to that home to do some kind of install of what we call consumer premises equipment or customer premises equipment, which is just to say something that's usually attached to the exterior wall or an interior wall that receives some kind of signal from the wider network that then turns it into a Wi-Fi signal inside the home. Um, for those of you who have been doing this for long enough, in the mid 2000s, there was a lot of excitement around Wi-Fi networks in the streets and whether that would be the third pipe. And the problem was if you put Wi-Fi transmitters out in the streets, the signals just didn't provide enough information when they got inside the home. Even if they could penetrate the home, it would not be a high quality enough signal to deliver high capacity networks. So a lot of the challenge of short-term and long-term planning is trying to figure out, can you get inside the home and what are the costs, both capital and operating, in order to keep that going. So San Rafael is a place in which they have, I think, been very sharp about using grant money and public money to try to extend this network in the streets, and it can get inside some homes, but they acknowledge that there's more work to be done to be able to deliver a higher quality signal inside the home. Providence, Rhode Island is very similar. There's a neighborhood called Olneyville. This GAP network, or Life Raft network, was more focused on, again, racial equity and issues around healthcare to try to not just provide access for kids in school, but also to improve healthcare outcomes, because this neighborhood was an outlier in Rhode Island regarding a number of healthcare outcomes. And they wanted to use this. So again, this is a primarily outdoor network that was built in order to, again, also often with a lot of support from philanthropy and local governments providing the money, some volunteer resources, a lot of local coordination from people that meant well. And it's worth noting, in both San Rafael and Providence, when we interviewed them, there was this sense of, if we knew how hard this was going to be when we started, we might not have gone down it, because these things are challenging. And frankly, it's disappointing when you put in this much work and people aren't always able to get it inside the home. These are important steps, though, to being able then to build the coalitions that may be necessary to build the longer term networks. So I still think these networks are quite important. Now, in Pittsburgh, there's a project called MetaMesh, which is also wireless, but in this case, they actually installed devices on the exterior of homes so they could deliver 30 to 50 megabits per second inside the home. A high quality connection for more than 450 neighborhoods, delivering on the order of 50 megabits down, 25 up. And that is more than sufficient to be able to have multiple high quality video chats to stream, different video if you're trying to watch YouTube videos for education or entertainment. That is a capacity of connection that should be able to meet most household needs. It may not be ideal, but you're not going to have having to tell one person to hang up their video chat so another person could. But this is a project that got inside the home. It did have higher labor costs. It's a 1-year pilot project that is not done with that year yet. And so we're watching to see what happens. But a goal of it is that it would be handed over to the schools to administer moving forward, I believe, was one of their early goals. And I'll be curious to see how that happens, because schools aren't necessarily well equipped or desiring of having to troubleshoot equipment like this that might be not working well on the side of a home of a student. Now, as we move into more fixed investments that might be for a more longer term, I think it's really worth noting that mobile homes are kind of an interesting case. As we're talking about this, if you put an external transmitter up, depending on building materials, on a single family home that's more of a permanent home, you probably won't be able to get a high quality signal inside of it. The building materials in mobile home parks are actually more conducive to receiving that signal. And so wireless might be a longer term solution that can deliver a higher quality signal. You also have a higher incidence of poverty often within mobile home parks. And so it is well worth considering that as a distinct consideration. And in fact, I should say that when we talk with communities about strategies, one of the things we like to say is you don't have a broadband problem. Like, that's not the issue. You have different kinds of broadband problems. They're united in a lack of broadband, perhaps, but the problems that you may have in terms of low income families is quite different from the problem of making sure that enterprises have high quality signal and that you have a healthy job climate for that. Similarly, even within low income households that live in high density housing developments where there might be 30, 40, 50 families or more in a building, that is a different profile of the economics of solving that for broadband than single family poverty would be. We have a lot of solutions that can deal with the single families, I'm sorry, with the opposite, with what we call MDUs in the business, but what we think of as apartment buildings or public housing, where you have higher density of households. In California, in San Francisco, there's a wonderful project that is not alone at this point. There's other public housing entities around the country that are doing this, but they've recognized that by using fixed wireless to get on the roof of high density buildings that have a high incidence of poverty or public housing, is very economical to then distribute that signal within the building using the wires of the building. And so in this case, they're delivering a gigabit to thousands upon thousands of residents of public housing for a cost of $10 a month, often which is not borne by the actual household themselves. But the economics of doing this high density approach are quite different from the economics of doing that on a single family home. If a radio costs a few $1,000s to put on a roof top, and you can distribute that to 40 or 50 families, that is quite different than if you are trying to put a multi-$1,000 radio on a single family home, because that home might generate $10 a month, it might not. You're not going to be able to pay those capital costs off with one family, but if you can distribute it to more families, so you're spreading those fixed costs more widely, it's just a lot easier to do. I think, if there was significant buy-in from states or the federal government, the costs of making sure everyone in public housing had high quality internet access are such that we could do it in 18 months. You could have someone that running for office that set a goal and said, we're going to make sure that, whether it's every child, every senior, or just every family in public housing is going to have a high quality internet connection. You would start by going after these high density areas. And that's a part of this, again, thinking short term and long term. There's a mix for that depending on what the assets are as to whether that would be considered sort of short or long term, because you can do it kind of quickly in certain areas if you have the right rooftop agreements and you have the right line of sight and things like that. In other cases, it might take a while to line that up. So as we're, again, working through this and thinking more about long term now, as we're transitioning out of these shorter term solutions, in the longer term, we're thinking more about how to get inside the home with a high quality connection. And that might be a connection that's owned by the community. It might be a connection that the community tries to lower the cost of a private entity doing with some mixture of approaches. It might be a connection that is delivered directly by the community. So there's a variety of approaches. When you start looking at that.
One second and ask a couple of points of clarification from our audience here. Two things that are coming in. We're wondering if the electrical cooperative will be a long-term solution if they choose to develop internet connections. And then someone else asked, when you mentioned the 1 gig speed that you were doing, I believe from the rooftop, is that even enough to be helpful? So I think as you're framing the conversation, maybe if you could address those.
Sure. Yeah, I look to history for guidance on anything that we can, and electric cooperatives have proven remarkably efficient, effective, beneficial for rural areas for 70 years, delivering internet access or more in some cases. So I absolutely think that in areas where electric cooperatives are operating, if they are doing high quality internet access, that is possibly the best solution. They are entities that are accountable to the community through elections to their board. And so I very strongly believe electric cooperatives are an important part of this and are a long-term solution. They could also engage in short-term solutions. I mean, Ozarks Go with that fiber to the school bus, that's a short-term solution while they are actually building out fiber to the homes of everyone in their service territory. Now, regarding a gigabit, yes, if you have 30 or 50 families sharing a gigabit, sure, it would be nice if it was 10 gigabits or 40 gigabits, but that is a capacity that is extremely useful at that, even split among 30 to 50 families, because at no time would you expect everyone to actually be uploading and downloading at the same time. This gets into what we might think of as what many in the industry call oversubscription, which is to say, if you have 10 families that each have a gigabit, you don't necessarily need 10 gigabits of capacity to aggregate all that together, because not everyone is using their internet fully to its maximum potential at all times. So that was a good time to take a quick break on the questions. This, as we transition again into the longer term, we did a little flow chart here with another organization. It's 4 pages of dense of discussion about some of these things that I'm talking about, with a little bit of different examples perhaps. Michigan it does not engage in robust preemption against local governments in the way that some other states do. So you can kind of pass through that part, but you can look at different ideas about how to separate these problems and think about short-term and long-term. This is the schoolwork slide now. I mean, the hard work slide, which is Michigan does preempt localities from doing certain things unless they have done an RFP. So this is something that others like Mike Watsa and others, I'm sure plenty of people at Merit can explain in greater detail. So I don't want to go too deep into it, but communities have to jump through a series of hoops before they build certain kinds of networks as a municipality. There's also something that Michigan has done, which several other states have done, which is that it has a broadband subsidy program, but it does not make it available to community networks, specifically to municipal networks. That's quite frustrating. Municipal networks are often the ones that are most likely to serve low-income folks that have been left behind, or the more rural areas where there's a harder business case. So I just think that that's it's just straight up favoritism to cable and telephone companies when we see language like that. The 25.3 standard is obsolete. I suspect that whether it's this year or early next year, the Federal Communications Commission will have a faster definition for broadband. And so any money that is spent today on a network that is only what we call 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up, is effectively building the next obsolete connection. It's not a good investment. And then the Connect America Fund areas are areas of Michigan that receive money to upgrade to, again, a connection that is 3 times slower than that 25.3 standard. And so that those areas are not even eligible for funding to achieve a higher level is quite an oversight and a mistake. And again, we see that kind of favoritism to protect telephone companies, most often the largest telephone companies who have neglected investing in the rural areas, to protect them, even though it's 2021 and they have had plenty of time to upgrade. So I wanted to include some good news. Ohio is worse. I know for some of you that's very important. And Ohio actually goes further. And even though Ohio doesn't have any limitations on municipal networks, it does not even fund cooperatives. And so at least Michigan will allow cooperatives to apply for its broadband subsidies. Ohio does not. And that's just ridiculous. Literally, the people that brought electric power to the nation are not able to help bring the next great technology. Just atrocious. And then in Arkansas, we see a retrenchment. In Arkansas, we saw, I think the next slide here, yeah, I'm not going to read that, of course, but Arkansas, we just saw a unanimous legislature, which is overwhelmingly Republican, voted without a single dissent to significantly remove preemption, to give communities more power to engage in public-private partnerships and to build their own networks. And this was just 2 or 3 weeks ago. We're already seeing now one community is ready to build their own network. I'm quietly hearing there's another 2 or 3. There's existing networks that have been successful or about to expand to neighbors. This is tremendous, and this is what we should be seeing. But instead, we're seeing people who are playing games. I'm going to speed up just a little bit to make sure that I don't overrun the Q&A period too much. One of the great things that we're seeing right now is this approach in North Carolina called Band NC, which is an effort to engage local planning in every single county in North Carolina. Sometimes people would assume that that would be very costly. In North Carolina, they're allotting a $5,000 maximum per county to engage in local planning. And that money can be used for a couple of different things. But the important part is that, you know, this is something that could cost well under $1 million. It's something that a significant source of philanthropy could cover by itself to make sure that every corner of Michigan is engaged in local planning. This is something that Merit has made very easy in Michigan. There's no state that has the advantages that Merit has created in terms of the wealth of knowledge, the teams. And so Michigan could really, really demonstrate again how to engage in this local planning if we saw even more money available, but not a ton, to just incent that local planning. So I wasn't sure how to fit this in, but CBRS is a technology that is quite exciting right now. And there's, I don't know, 10,000, more than that, networks being built right now that are using this technology. It's exciting in part because it's this thing called spectrum sharing, which isn't all that important for this. I mean, if you want to get into it, you can read about it, or I can do a more advanced one later. But the important point is that there is spectrum that is available for entities to use to deliver these services. You put up an antenna, in this case, it's on a school, I think was how it was laid out in Minneapolis, as this is just a demonstration. And the red is where you get great coverage. The yellow is okay coverage. The green, you still get coverage, but it's not going to be as strong. And for about a 6-block radius, about a half mile, you can deliver pretty decent service 2 homes. But the thing is that you don't actually have to install stuff on every home. You give people a puck. We call it a puck because we're in the north, right? But you give them a little electronic device, and they don't have to attach it to the outside of their home. They can use it in most cases inside the home. Although if there's problems, there's certainly things you could install on the outside of the home, as needed in 5 to 10% of the cases. I was specking this out to try and get a sense of what it might look like in St. Paul, in a neighborhood that's challenged by a lot of people that cannot afford access. And we were looking at on the order of $500,000, $600,000 all told. That's pretty conservative, I think. Half of that is for the devices that you give to people and would have to be managed, and then the rest of that is for managing the system, getting a fiber to the roof of a building that's above the tree canopy, getting a 20 amp service up there, having a space to put the device and to mount the antennas. And for that, and then you have to pay for the recurring costs of the bandwidth and the electricity. But that's sort of like an all-in cost of, let's call it like $700,000 over 5 years. You can deliver to about 1,000 people a decent connection, which I would assume you're probably like in the 40 megabits down, 10, 20 up, perhaps. Really depends on where you are and how many people are using it at a given time. But this is a solution that does not require you to go to every single home, send teams out. And so the labor costs are much better. And there's other people here who might be more familiar with this technology that can talk about it. But I wanted to raise an example from Tucson, which is right now doing this. And they're putting up 40 cell towers. They have a bunch of municipal fiber that is already in the ground that they can access. These areas will cover 32,000 households. Today, they have more than 300 people connected. They offer a filtered service that's aimed for free to children and seniors. It costs them, well, I shouldn't say it costs them 5.1 million. We don't know exactly how much, but they used 5.1 million from the CARES Act. And here's back to that planning that's important about this, is that you need to have these plans available, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen next from the state or the federal government. But when money becomes available, you don't then want to start thinking about designing a network like this. You want to have the plans ready so you can get right at the front of the line, start spending that money quickly to be able to deliver these high quality services. And then sometimes I think it's worth noting, I don't think that these companies are evil. I think there's an important role for private sector investment, but it really upsets me when you see a city that's just trying to connect a few, 10,000 low-income kids and seniors to a basic internet service that doesn't even offer Netflix or Hulu, doesn't allow you to do anything that would be X-rated, and the local telephone and cable companies are trying to fight against it and trying to disrupt it. It's just frustrating, but that's the reality we have to face. I wanted to highlight this, which is, some of you, most of you are in Michigan. I'm guessing there's probably a few trickled in who aren't. The resources in the Michigan Moonshot are incredibly useful. I've mentioned that a few times, and I just can't say enough how wonderful it is that they've organized it. And I really hope that you're all taking advantage of it. And with that, we can go into Q&A.
All right, fantastic, Chris. We have had quite a few questions come in. I'm just going to start at the top and go down the list. Do any ISPs participate in the Community Networks program?
Well, I'm not sure what I said that might have been a little bit confusing. The Community Networks program that I do is one of research and some advocacy, a lot of media education, and some direct technical advice. I actually co-host a show with a guy who runs a local ISP in Minneapolis. For anyone who's seen Connect This, which is a show that we do on YouTube live occasionally, covering in-depth discussions of this stuff. Like, that's not really for beginners. I have a lot of people that follow our work that are small ISPs. I deeply respect the hard work that it takes to run small ISPs. And so we certainly have them participating. We try to raise up their successes, but our general focus is on networks that are harder to centralize, which is our philosophy is basically we want to see a lot of smaller networks that serve communities. And our concern about private ISPs is that they are the ones that will be picked off most often by companies that are looking to become the next Comcast. Right? Comcast grew by buying great local companies and not so great local companies, a mix of all these companies. It didn't really expand by building its own networks necessarily. And small private ISPs, it's their decision alone. The community has no input over whether or not they ultimately become part of the next big monopoly, which may not provide the same level of service that a local ISP would. So that's the only reason that we don't spend more time on them.
All right, thank you, Chris. What's the best way to ensure that you don't run out of funds as you deploy?
That's a good question. I mean, I certainly think having technical people and at the outset to have a sense of what's realistic. I mean, that's why I really value having Travis Carter or other small ISPs that have informed our conversations and the work that we do, because we want them to say, no, that's not realistic. You know, like you think you're going to spend this much, but actually, you know, the permitting might be higher, and you might have to idle some crews when you have bad weather, and so you have to plan in contingency fees. And so I think having good relationships with local ISPs, I mean, especially, I would hope electric co-ops are generally amenable to sharing, you know, that kind of expertise with potential partners. But having a group that includes ISPs can be really useful. One of the things I point to is Maine's Broadband Coalition, which the state actually helped to create and maintain a little bit, but involves, you know, people like me that are advocates, but also small ISPs who are all willing to just try to figure out how to make Maine much better connected. And making sure that you have people with different experience in this is important to making sure you have the right forecasts when you're developing these plans.
All right, thank you. Moving on. It seems that local entities are in a position to best understand the needs of their communities. What do we need to do to make the money available to local organizations instead of the ISPs?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, many of us, I shouldn't say, I'm going to speak for myself. I was enthusiastic about the reverse auction mechanism that the FCC just used for something called RDOF. Now, that might have gone over a number of people's heads, but the Federal Communications Commission decided to spend you know, more than $10 billion to improve internet access in rural areas using a reverse auction in which different ISPs could compete, and basically whoever offered the best deal to the government to deliver a high quality service would get that award. And there's a lot of technologies that were allowed to participate that we don't think can actually achieve what they've claimed. And there's other problems with that auction. But fundamentally, the biggest problem is that, you know, you have, in the case of West Virginia, for instance, most of the money went to a company called Frontier, which I think serves a little bit in Michigan, maybe. But Frontier has just been at odds with the state of West Virginia for years, and has a history of delivering extremely poor service. People are very frustrated with it, and the idea that that some people in DC would decide that, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars would go to Frontier to improve access in West Virginia was just really frustrating. So I think one of the most important things is that money that comes forward, whether it is distributed by the state or by the federal government, there should be a process for local letters of support that would give extra points to the ISPs that had the trust of communities. We will see, I expect that we will see a bill passes this year that will put a whole lot of money, like tens of billions, maybe $100 billion into broadband across the United States. A lot of that will be distributed by the FCC, and a fair amount of it will be distributed by states directly. And in both cases, we need elected leaders to be making sure they demand local accountability as a part of those project awards.
Do you think that the Networks Need Economic Competition Today, Connect Act, will pass, and what will be the impact on community networks?
Yeah, this is a bill that, if I'm remembering correctly, this is one that was introduced as part of a package that the Republicans in the U.S. House that are most tasked with working on telecom have put forth a package of bills. One of them is something called the Connect Act, which would make municipal broadband effectively illegal in most of the United States. It was introduced around the same time that you have Arkansas Republicans unanimously deciding that they need diversity in how they are solving broadband across their state. And so the first thing I would say is that it shows to me a significant difference between the base of the Republican Party and Republicans who are in D.C. who believe that that we should have less competition in these broadband networks. Often because they just hear too often from lobbyists. They hear more from lobbyists on this issue than they do from their own, the communities that they come from. I do not think it will pass. I can't imagine that it will even be discussed further in committee. And so I do not think it will have much of an impact. But it was heartening to see that tech press, I mean, within a few days of that being introduced, there was articles all around the nation about how this was a terrible idea. And I mean, just to give you a sense, that legislation would shut down 3 of the top 10 best broadband networks in the US as rated by speed by PC Magazine. 4 of the other top 10 are networks that are some kind of partnership, and it wouldn't be clear if they could continue or not. And so it would just be incredibly disruptive. And I think it's something that was put forward as a messaging bill, because for some reason, these again, primarily Republicans in DC believe community networks should be prohibited.
Thank you. Could you elaborate more on how the digital divide creates financial barriers for low-income folks in their communities?
Yes. I mean, it's hard to imagine. One of the things that I'm really excited about, spin this question a different way in a second, is that Chattanooga became the first city to eliminate the digital divide. Over the summer last year, when people were looking at this reality that you have millions of children unable to go to school, Chattanooga figured out how to raise the money to build fiber connections to 17,000 families in the free and reduced lunch program in the Chattanooga area, and delivers 100 megabit service, which is a very high quality service to them for free for 10 years. No city has anything like that. And right now, the one of the people involved with that, Deb Sosha, who's been involved with merit programming in the past, Deb is just a treasure. She's been working on raising money to be able to study this, to see how lives change when they have high quality internet access at this scale. I believe that we will see things like certainly healthcare outcomes improve as telemedicine becomes more available to these households. I think we'll actually see not just grades improve, but disciplinary records improve, in that we'll see less acting out and disciplinary problems. And so to answer that question, there's so many different knock-on effects, so many things that just spill over to not having home internet access that change other aspects of your life. It's hard to just come up with whether it's a number or a description of how disruptive it is to not be able to have home internet access in the year 2021. I've been amazed at Wilson, North Carolina, one of the most spectacular municipal fiber to the home networks in the nation. Years ago, they were among the first to really figure out how to start really trying to push that network to benefit low-income folks. And there's a story about a woman named Tiffany Cooper, who was a single mother living with 2 children, that Susan Crawford tells this story in her book, Fiber, which is a wonderful book. Susan Crawford does really good work. And Tiffany Cooper was able, because she had internet access in her unit then that was robust, she was able to complete a nursing certificate program, I believe, and put herself on a much better direction, economically speaking. Her children, their outcomes improved in school. And in part, you can imagine why. Try being a single mother, might even be working 1 or 2 jobs, trying to do this education thing, and you're having to wrangle 2 children to take them to the library in order to do that, so they can maybe do their homework. You're standing in line. It's incredibly disruptive. There's, solving the digital divide will not end poverty. Like, it is a very challenging problem, but solving the digital divide, whether we're talking about urban or rural poverty, it just makes everything much easier to deal with. It improves healthcare, improves education opportunities, improves economic opportunities. And so I think it's tremendously important.
What are your thoughts about Starlink helping in the rural areas to provide the silver bullet when it comes to providing good, reliable internet access?
Well, it's nice that the word silver bullet is in there, because I can say that categorically it won't be a silver bullet. But I'm enthusiastic about Starlink. I've come around. Now Starlink is going to create problems. Like it's not all good, but Starlink is exciting. It's a rare technology that seems to be delivering beyond what it promised. We've tried to look at the reviews and talk to folks who have used it, and it's an impressive service. It works much better than the conventional satellites. It's delivering, services that are not quite up to cable speeds, but comparative. It it's expensive. I think that price will drop over time. But here's the problem: is that I do not think it's something that alone is good enough. I don't think we should have people in rural areas dependent solely on low Earth orbit satellites for broadband, in part because I suspect that even though there's other companies that will be doing it, I think they will join together. I think that they will form a dynamic kind of like the cable companies, which I don't want to, the big cable companies. Again, I can heap praise on Comcast for some aspects of what they do. Their American Customer Satisfaction Index survey is quite low. If you read consumer reports about people's opinions about cable companies, it's quite low. I would expect that Starlink, or whatever the name of the amalgamated small Earth orbit satellite companies will be in 4 years, will also have low rankings. We just sort of see that with companies that are distant from the customers that they deal with on a regular basis. And so I think we do need to build out terrestrial networks to folks. And that will be harder to do with Starlink in there, because a business model that previously could have got 60 or 70% of the market and succeeded may have trouble getting 40 or 50% of the market in the short term, because of Starlink being out there. But I think if you look at the value that electric cooperatives are providing in a lot of states, Missouri, Arkansas, where they've been at it for a while, they provide incredible value and great service, and I think that they will win, but it's going to be harder for them in a world where people can choose from Starlink. So it's good and bad. I mean, it's a classic double-edged sword.
How are school districts dealing with the content filtering requirement if they provide internet access to their communities?
That I don't entirely have a good enough grasp on. I think it's across the board. In that, I shouldn't say across the board. I think that most of the schools that I've seen have not elected to really provide robust internet access. Like I think Northern Michigan University is probably one of the few that has grappled with this. But there's a report that's going to come out from the Department of Education before too long that draws lessons from some of these efforts, and I'm looking forward to that being public. But I feel like in my own independent research, what I've seen is that this is a problem for schools in that they are doing. I think they're nervous about unfiltering it, and I think that's potentially appropriate. I mean, schools should not be solving broadband problems for the entire community. They've stepped up in many cases, and I think that's even heroic. I mean, schools have been tasked with ending childhood malnutrition effectively. So, like, maybe it's not crazy that we're also seeing many of them stepping up now to provide broadband solutions, but it's not appropriate. It's a sign that something's failed. And so I hope that that's a short-term issue. I don't really have a better answer regarding what the lessons of it have been.
Would it be fair to say when we use the internet, we are not using it to the full capacity, but being charged for it? Can you talk more about how 1 gig can be shared amongst 10 families?
Yes. Now, this gets, I like to use an analogy of a bar room. And it's important to get a sense of how networks work. A network that is at 99% capacity, it doesn't work. In a similar sense to a crowded bar. As networks get beyond like 50 or 60% capacity, which is to say if you have a 10 megabit network and you have 5-6 megabits of traffic on it consistently, you start to have this effect where you're in a bar with a bunch of people, you're talking to 1 or 2 people, and it's louder in the bar, so you talk louder. You talk louder, and everyone else starts talking louder. And this is a common issue with the protocols that are used to exchange internet traffic. So the result is that as you have congestion, it feeds upon itself and it can collapse effectively. You don't want to build a network that will run consistently at very high congestion. So Yes, we are paying for connections that we are not fully using in the same way that we pay for interstates that, we could park a lot of cars on the interstate. We could park many more cars on the interstate then we can drive on it safely. And we can drive on an interstate with a higher capacity of cars if we all go 20 miles an hour than if we go 70. But we make those trade-offs to make sure that we have the optimal experience. And with networks, it's similar in that we don't use the full capacity. That's not a sign that something's gone wrong. I've never maxed out the total amount of electricity coming into my home, by turning on every single light that I have and running all the devices at the same time just to see if I could overload it. But I pay for that capacity anyway. That's how I think about it. But like when you talk about a gigabit and then sharing that among multiple families, it does get different depending on what your assumptions are. And if you're getting a gigabit from Comcast and you're sharing that among multiple families, then you're violating the terms of use because they've priced that connection in a way that is designed to get them a certain amount of return. And there's been people who have done that in the past, and I think it's better to make sure that you have connections that are able to be shared if you're going to be doing that sort of a thing.
Do you know of a way that people can locate their electric co-ops, their local electric co-ops?
Yes, I think the best thing to do is probably to look at just do an internet search for electric cooperatives in the state, and there's probably a state electric cooperative association that will have maps. You can find resources that have maps of the United States from the Trade Association, which is NRECA, which is the National Rural Electric Cooperative of America, or National Rural Electric Cooperative Association or Alliance or something like that, but it's NRECA. They'll have a lot of that information to find. And one of the things, it's interesting, there's like 700-800 electric co-ops, more than 100 are providing service today. Another, 100, 200 are on the fence. Several of them have categorically rejected it, but we've seen cases, and we've covered in Delta Montrose in Colorado and in New Hampshire's electric cooperative, where management and even the board said, we don't want to get into broadband. It's too hard, it's too complicated, we don't want to deal with it, we think it's a risk. I'm not going to just poo-poo that. Like, this is it's a hard business decision that needs to be taken seriously. But the members of the cooperative felt so strongly, they organized a campaign, and in both those cases the board changed its mind. I also know of a case in Virginia where people have been organizing for years to try to convince the board to change its mind to provide service, and they have not yet achieved that. So the first step is figuring out if you're a member of a cooperative and what their position on this is. But it's certainly possible to organize to push them in the direction that you'd like to see them go.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. It looks like we answered all the questions. We're going to wrap things up now. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we do?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people need to do more of is reaching out to talk to people who have been there. I think if you're a local leader who's considering this, the people who have been there themselves have reached out to others, and it's a circle. And so whether it's reaching out to someone like me, who hopefully I'll get to your emails. Sometimes I get a little overloaded and don't get back to everyone, or someone that they've run across in the news. Having that 10-15-minute discussion or email exchange can really save you not years, that's ridiculous, save you hours of research, and that might be unproductive. So I think people should not be bashful about reaching out to ask for help from people they come across in news articles and things like that.
Great. And as you were closing out there, Chris, we did get one more question. Somebody would like you to touch on PA224. If you could do that for just a minute or two.
Yeah, that's the slide that I had. I think my slides are still up here, right? This is the bill that provided a broadband subsidy program. And if I'm mangling this, Pierrette, I assume will jump in and fix my information. But this is the bill.
Chris.
What's that?
I said you'll do just fine, Chris.
This is someone who's more familiar with Michigan. If I knew Mike Watson was here, I'd ask him too. But because I deal with these bill numbers everywhere, I believe this is the bill that was passed last year, created a broadband subsidy program, and made sure that it would go primarily to private entities, which includes cooperatives, as I understand it, which is very good at a minimum. But it did say no municipal or educational networks would be eligible, which is a problem. And I believe that we'll see this again this year if it hasn't already been introduced. It's just foolish to cut off access to these solutions. I mean, what it's saying effectively is that the state, rather than comparing applications for a given area and determining which one is the most cost effective, is going to arbitrarily say, even if the local government can do a better job at a lower cost to the taxpayer, we don't care. We'd rather have this private company get the money because we don't like local governments, I guess. I mean, there's a real bias against local governments, and I think a lot of it comes from the cable and telephone companies trying to run down these efforts because they represent a threat to competition. There's also another bill in Michigan. There's several actually dealing with property taxes as an incentive to improve internet access, which is something we've seen in many states. And you certainly, if you remove property taxes, it's possible that a few networks would expand a little further than they otherwise would if you're not taxing the property of that's used to provide the network. But AT&T or Comcast, they're not going to change their investment patterns based on something like that. It's extremely unlikely, and if they did, it would probably impact very few homes. And when you mess around with the tax code that way, particularly when it's more related on income taxes and things, you're really focused again on just the private providers. And if we did that with electricity, many of the people who are here might not be here, because the US economy would have struggled so much harder in the 40s, 50s, 60s if we didn't have electrification everywhere. And we got electrification everywhere by recognizing that a private sector led model was appropriate in many parts of the country, but in other parts of the country, it just didn't get the job done. And we see the same thing with broadband internet access. It's not a matter of saying everyone needs a nonprofit solution, but there's many areas in which a nonprofit solution might be the best approach. And so that's just my frustration with those kinds of laws. And then I did see someone suggested that I plug my podcast again, which is Community Broadband Bits, in which we try to have serious discussions of this. And I say, if anyone on here is like extremely of a different ideological viewpoint than what I've been presenting, I think it's one of the upcoming episodes is with Baron Zoka, who runs Tech Freedom, which is an organization that is opposed to just about everything that I believe. But we decided to have a very civil conversation about things that we agree and disagree, and so I think it's important to have different viewpoints out there. But Community Broadband Bits is my weekly podcast, and occasionally we do a podcast called Let's Connect. Both are available on all the common podcast platforms.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us. As a reminder, you will receive an email notification with a link to the recording in the next few days. Be on the lookout for more educational series webinars in the future. All upcoming events for Moonshot can be found on the Education and Resources page of merit.edu/moonshot. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.